These are some pictures I took from this show I watched some of like in December when I was at someone's house called Young Sheldon, which has a long backstory. But anywho, I thought that these pictures would be good for like when I finally make the long anticipated video about how trauma can make somebody want to become transhuman. And I've been wanting to make that video for some years, like a lot of years now. When I'll actually do it, I have no idea. But those are some good pictures to start off this video, though. So, autism, schizophrenia, schizonarc as I call it, BPD, and personality disorders in general. How they're all connected, and the different bullcrap revolving around all these different labels. Also, how Down syndrome can eventually turn into schizophrenia. And so can autism too when the person goes through a lot of abuse and neglect. And it kind of reminds me of this comment that I seen someone make. It was honestly some bull crap, but they were talking about how mental health professionals say that untreated autism turns into schizophrenia. Now, what untreated or treated autism is, I have no clue. But I was thinking about how autism and Down syndrome can turn into schizophrenia due to abuse and neglect. And that made me think back to that comment about quote-unquote untreated autism. Then how girls with BPD and boys commonly run after pedos for validation and stuff. And modern autism, or the quote-unquote new autism as I like to call it. And how it's pretty much just CPTSD. So, old versus new autism. To start this off, I'm gonna have to bring up some things from my Cash for Kids system situation. Now, what I will say is that I got over 20 plus labels, and I'm pretty sure most were honestly never put on paper. It was just things that my relatives would say to me to insult me, to be honest. But I can definitely say that due to the fact that I got over 20 labels, the fact that I did at one point get the autism label somewhat, sort of, kind of, was more so a coincidence. I was also given that label due to a lot of things that weren't true, and it was really just used against me as an insult. But there was also the fact that none of the doctors actually agreed that I was autistic. But of course, in the Cash for Kids system, I mean, they get paid to help abuse you. So, the funny thing is, since I've done research on autism and what used to be called Asperger's, and have seen other people that have gotten the label or say that they could have got the label, I see some similarities. I also see how people who are anointed or prophetic in general could get these labels. But since I've done research on it, I have how do I put this? I could somewhat identify with it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's like doing research now, I could somewhat identify with it. But the way I got the label, just like the other ones, was in a Cash for Kids system situation, and none of the doctors agreed. But honestly, now I find that kind of funny. But I mean, sure, I was just being told that I was just retarded and stuff then, and it wasn't really any grounds to me getting the label. With the way I did get it, this probably isn't coming out right, but it's just funny to me now. In fact, two people that I could say I identify with that have gotten the label or identify with the label themselves, although of course I would never tell anybody to claim any of these made up labels. I wouldn't advise doing that. But two people, one being T. Zandos, no, that would be the second one. The first one would be LT Corbis. Like, it was actually kind of funny, the similarities. including the whole situation of like people feeling some type of way because of somebody quote unquote knowing too much too young, or different things that revolve around that. So yeah, those are the two. But yeah, anywho, in my previous situation, the only like few two people that would go along with the autism label or say that they agree with it, it was behind some racial stuff. And they weren't even quote unquote medical professionals, they were just side cash for kids system staff. So like this one lady that was kind of connected to the whole Jim Crow placement that I got put in as a punishment, which is another long story. So it wasn't like um any quote unquote mental health type people, which commonly when you do ask mental health professionals about the autism label, especially these days, they'll say that they're not qualified to really give any input on that, which is very interesting since it's quote unquote a mental illness and all that bull crap. But yeah, so anywho, it was the pediatrician that mentioned Asperger's based off of a whole bunch of things that they were told about me that honestly weren't true, which kind of were some very concerning things. But I supposedly couldn't feel pain, so whoopings didn't work. What was the other thing? I thought my toys were alive, even though I didn't play with toys anyway. This was when I was 10, by the way. What was the other thing? I was funny and quote unquote didn't know I was funny because of the whole overly humorous thing that I mentioned in another video. I can't remember which one. I think it was one of the ones about why you shouldn't be desperate, but I meant to make a whole video about how if you're overly humorous because of trauma, or even because you learned it from your traumatized parent, how that could actually be used against you to say that you're quote unquote retarded. So being overly humorous equals retardation, supposedly. And those are the three main things I remember, to be honest. But then, of course, that eventually was swept to the side, and then the whole autism thing was never brought back up for like some years, because then it switched over to different labels that revolve around being something related to being retarded, but more so revolving around being delusional or something. But yeah, that's how the cash for kids system works. Like, there's a lot of unspecifieds too. I remember near the end of the situation of the 20 plus labels, at one point I was given the unspecified attention deficit disorder, and it's like, what is that? But anywho, it was some off branch of the bad black kid with ADHD label. But anywho, to get into the story, so, what was it? Oh yeah, so that pediatrician situation happened, and she mentioned Asperger's. Then when I started getting pushed deeper into the cash for kids system, this one psychiatrist was like, Asperger's doesn't even exist anymore, and I don't agree with the autism label, which of course it was still carried along anyway, but just like it continued to be. He was like, I don't agree with that, and I'm gonna report the pediatrician to get her fired for even trying to diagnose somebody, because she doesn't even have the authority to diagnose someone. And then he was like, the diagnosis doesn't make a difference anyway, because autism and schizophrenia is the same thing. Oh man. But pretty much, he didn't want me to be autistic because you can't make money off of that, especially not high functioning or Asperger's. So he wanted to like uh, do whatever he wanted to do, and it would have been easier for me to go back and sue people if they would have kept the Asperger's label, but drugged me and all those different things that messed my health up. Which, I mean, due to the fact that I was in a Munchausen and cash for kids system situation, I would have got drugged regardless, to be honest. I mean, plenty of people do have the Asperger's label and they still get drugged, so it doesn't make much of a difference. But yeah, so That was what was behind that. But that also makes me think about how in the 2010s autism was still seen no different than being a psychopath or a quote unquote sociopath. So there's that. And now I can go into the whole new autism thing. Before I go into that though, I do have to say, when you're in the multiple branches of the Cash for Kids system, higher or lower level, the point of the labels is to brainwash you into believing that you're just bad, crazy, and slow, and to actually make you really develop those issues so you can continue to be a cash cow in a social experiment and be taken advantage of by your abusers. Same reason why when somebody's being sex trafficked, the psychiatrist will give them a label like, I don't know, schizophrenia or something, to help the traffickers say that they just have schizophrenic delusions that they're being sex trafficked, whatever that would even mean. But yeah, so when you're in the cash for kids system abuse systems, the point of the labels isn't to give you the right label anyway. In fact, it actually takes a certain amount of trauma. Okay, the background noise was throwing me off. It takes a certain amount of trauma for you to even develop these issues anyway. So you're getting labels that you don't actually have when you're in these situations. So keep that in mind. You're not like getting an evaluation, actually try to give you the right diagnosis. And in the beginning of the situation, you don't really have, well, I mean, this depends on your situation to be honest, but you don't really have any like permanent, quote unquote, permanent issues yet. Therefore, all the mental labels you get are going to be false. New autism. New autism, first, is a lowering of criteria to be diagnosed with autism. In the past, you used to have to, like, show serious symptoms of disability to actually get diagnosed with autism. But in recent years, the criteria has been lowered. So now anybody that can read, count, washes their hands, and has empathy and doesn't lack emotions can be diagnosed with autism. 2. CPTSD. Modern autism is the same symptoms as CPTSD, which is also why now they're talking about traumatized and non-traumatized autism. But I'd still say people with CPTSD are getting labeled off as autistic, just like when you're in the Cash for Kids system. Your abuse symptoms will be labeled off as autism to make money off of you, and for the Cash for Kids system staff and your abusive relatives to make you feel like you're the issue, because that's what these labels are all about. So, like, if you've been essayed or something to the point where you really don't talk, they're going to say that you have nonverbal autism, even though you don't have autism. And, of course, still, there's no test for any of these things. Or at least that's what they used to say, but actually, they don't tell you that there's actually tests for some of these labels, because then you would get tested and know you really don't have them. You just need to change your diet or fix your situation. Because actually, there are tests for some of these things, but they're just really expensive, and insurance doesn't cover them because they don't want you to actually get tested and actually fix what you have going on, or supposedly have going on anyway. In fact, I remember back in the early parts of my Cash for Kids system situation, my mom had mentioned brain scans for autism, but the psychiatrist didn't like the idea of me having the autism label, so they lied and said there are no brain scans. Now, of course, she was on some bullcrap and they were on some bullcrap, but they were still lying. Then there's the brain damage, heavy metal, parasite, microbiome imbalance side. Also diet, if I didn't mention that. Insulin resistance of the brain is actually a big issue that's not talked about. There's so many different forms of diabetes that aren't talked about, to be honest, which I kind of mentioned in my playlist that's called Do You Secretly Have Diabetes or Mitochondrial Dysfunction, something like that. Then there's brain damage before birth and after birth. People being anointed or prophetic, which people who are anointed or prophetic are more likely to lose their mind from trauma or just not being able to understand their gifts in general. I also should have started this off by reminding people that schizophrenia means split minds, and all mental illness is different forms of double-mindedness. So really, all mental illness is schizophrenia. And now the racial side. So this was talked about a few times throughout my situation, especially near the end when autism was brought back up, because for a while it was the ODD, then there was the schizophrenia thing, and a lot of other things that I really just can't remember. But eventually the autism was brought back up. But still, none of the doctors around believed the autism or any of the other things. But there were some side Cash for Kids system staff that did agree with the autism label, but it was due to racial stuff. So like, being dark skinned and being able to read was autism apparently. Like in school, while being dark skinned, even though I mean I knew it was an indoctrination, but I liked going because it was something other than being at home. But that was autism supposedly, even though nobody actually likes school, to be honest. I mean, they always try to make it a racial thing, but the quote unquote white kids don't like school either. So, it was something else. Something else that I can't remember. Oh yeah, not talking loud or being quote unquote ghetto, which most of the ghetto stereotype is just having a southern accent, to be honest. But not being ghetto was autism, apparently. What else was it? It was a lot of other things that I really can't remember. I can say though that after the drugging situation, I definitely got more quote unquote autistic. Cause like specifically since 2020, I can't remember names or faces, and apparently some neurodivergent people can't remember faces. But that's an issue that I never had till I woke up from that coma in like December 2020. Then also some other things that I had got. But yeah, and that actually makes me think of this post I had seen by somebody who had the autism label, and they were told that the psychotropics would make them more autistic, but they were still forced to take them. So, the CPTSD side of autism. In modern times, the unfortunate thing is that having empathy is not only seen as being disabled and retarded, but it's also seen as a symptom of trauma for whatever reason, and it's seen as though you only care about other people because you've been through things, which is honestly really superficial and not really caring about other people. But yeah, so that's one of the symptoms with the CPTSD side. Then the constant apologizing, saying sorry for everything, people pleasing, putting other people before yourself, putting other people's needs before yourself, even people who don't care about you, which goes into fawning, codependency, fawn response, people pleasing, trauma bond, etc. Yeah, and those are both symptoms of CPTSD, but now people with CPTSD symptoms are getting told that they're just autistic, and that's why they apologize for everything. They're always worried about whether they're making somebody mad or people's facial expressions changing and wondering if they made the person mad. But that's a part of hypervigilance, though, because when you have certain types of abusers, or really when your abusers have certain types of demons, you have to like pretty much walk on eggshells and make sure they're not mad. If they're sad or mad, then they may be mad if you look happy, and different things like that. Those are all trauma symptoms. There was also a point in time where the autism label was used as, wait a minute, no, I'm saying this wrong. Where me, quote unquote, not being sexual or hypersexual, like quote unquote black people are, was used as proof I was autistic, at least in this sense of the autism label. But then that eventually got scratched off the table because I had a lot of sexual issues and was always sexually acting out, and it was actually really problematic. So there was that. And then another thing I noticed with modern autism, which I kind of mentioned somewhat, is how anybody who's clean is quote unquote autistic, just like how before this new autism craze, they would tell you had OCD if you washed your hands. So if you don't like to eat after other people, you're autistic and germophobic. If you shower, you're autistic. If you wash your hands, you're autistic. If you just don't like dirty things or being in dirty people's houses and stuff like that, that's all quote unquote autism. And then going back to the whole CPTSD side, now modern autism is grouping in with DPDR. So now if you have DPDR, a trauma symptom, they're telling you that's autism too. In fact, what they really don't want to say is a lot of quote unquote DPDR is actually seizures from insulin resistance, which is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like ADHD, the bad black boy ADHD label, it's not even just trauma or just straight up fake all the time, because it usually is fake just like the rest of these labels, but it's also a diet thing. Because with redlining comes food deserts and also just more chemicals in the food and just more crappy food. So, a lot of people have insulin resistance of the brain, and so they're rolling around on the floor and they're bouncing around and they're zoning out because they're actually having seizures because they pretty much have diabetes, because that's what insulin resistance is. So, ADHD is just like dementia and Alzheimer's, and I even believe that there's a form of schizophrenia that's also just another form of insulin resistance of the brain / diabetes of the brain. And so is PCOS and something else I can't remember. That also goes into the neglect because all they're eating is high fructose corn syrup and cereal and Hot Pockets and noodles and bread and cookies and ice cream. And of course, that also causes brain damage. Like, if you feed a baby Dr. Pepper, they could have brain damage and die. Like, there's this lady on YouTube who has schizophrenia for years. I remember meeting other people in anti-psychiatry groups would talk about her and about how she was so in love with taking her meds and being a junkie for psych drugs. But very recently, she apparently finally stopped taking those drugs and just changed her diet. And now she just about doesn't even have schizophrenia anymore. And she also cut off toxic family members because, of course, mental illness comes from trauma. So you're ignoring the trauma and the fact that your body can't handle certain foods, which is messing up your microbiome and messing up your brain. Hold on, what was I saying? I'm kind of out of it because my blood sugar's been low most of the day because I was eating cookie dough. You're ignoring the real issue to pick up this label and identify with this label and say you are schizophrenic as if that's your entire being and that's who you are. And instead of doing things to fix the issue or the quote unquote issue, you're just running around claiming a label and sitting in the victim complex revolving around the label, but you don't actually get taught to heal. So, the relation. For some years now, I've been coming to the conclusion that people who are anointed or prophetic or who are quote unquote autistic are more likely to develop personality disorders or schizophrenia. Now, one thing I'll go ahead and say, I can't think of any anointed or prophetic person in history who was anointed for evil or for good that couldn't get the modern day autism label. I can't think of any. Any person you could think of that was anointed or prophetic or is throughout history could meet the criteria for the autism label, just like how they could for schizophrenia as well. Like, for example, Moses. He's an old anointed or prophetic person. And so, one, he had speech issues. that could get you the autism label alone these days, or at least some learning disability label. And then he was really smart apparently since he was a baby. So that is the Asperger's label right there. And then the hearing from God thing, that would get you the schizophrenia label. So there's that. And then Jesus Christ, that's another example. So he was really smart since he was young, Asperger's. He ran away to go learn and teach people, Asperger's. He said he was the son of God and other things that would get him the schizophrenia label. So I can't think of anybody who's anointed or prophetic that couldn't get the modern day autism label or the schizophrenia label. And then I don't really watch her videos anymore, but Tiffany Buckner, for example, she's somebody who's anointed or prophetic with apostolic mantle. And she was even talking about in one of her videos how she was doing some research on the autism label because a lot of people had been talking about it. And she even sees how she could fit the criteria for high functioning autism. And if I remember right, there's this one prophet, don't even remember which book. I'm pretty sure it was Old Testament. His name was Jehu, and people said he runs like a maniac. So he had some type of abnormal way of walking and running, which is called abnormal gait, although it's commonly a side effect of psychotropics. But abnormal gait is also correlated with different learning disabilities and autism. So there's that, autism. Like in modern times, Apostle Paul, he would either be, well, not even either. He would be labeled as high functioning autism, but also even narcissistic, as people like to say these days, because he didn't sugarcoat things. And he was also really smart. I also should remind people that schizophrenia also revolves around the white supremacist philosophy of atheism. So, all melanated people are technically schizophrenic, and that's because Europeanism, as I could call it, revolved around atheism. Also, replacement theology and humanism, which is part of the philosophy where they had whitewashed the Bible because it was about worship of the self, and also the hijacking of religions that they didn't actually believe in, but they hijacked them to flip them around, but then would go back into atheism, or some of them go back into their pagan roots. But anyway, so that also goes hand in hand with like how, for example, white savior liberals will always talk about how they just see black people as crazy religious people because not being atheistic is insanity to them. So, of course, since melanated people are more spiritual and tend to be less atheistic or not atheistic at all, at least at one point, that itself is considered insanity and schizophrenia to Caucasians.